We are living now in the most integrated, globalized time in human history. For most of human history, people were separated from each other in tribes and countries and oceans and mountain ranges, prevented human contact, and we now live in the globalized, internet-connected world of the 21st century. For the first time in human history, the 7 billion people who live in the world are all connected through 193 nation states. So how do we think about these challenges ahead of us? I guess looking back on my own career, thinking about this, I teach now, I think we're living, especially as Americans, at the most complex time in our history. Now, that's a big statement. I don't want to exaggerate that point. I'm not saying it's the most fateful time, because that was the revolution that began in Boston 237 years ago. That was our fight for freedom against the British Empire. And it's certainly not the most dangerous time. That would have been the Civil War between 1860 and 1865. We're commemorating the 150th anniversary of that war. January 1st, 2013, 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the most significant acts in American history. That was the most dangerous time. We lost 700,000 people. We lost more Americans in the Civil War than in all of our wars combined over 2 centuries. So not the most fateful time, our time, not the most dangerous time, not even, ironically, I was talking about our globalized world, the time of our greatest engagement in the world, because we had 12 million American men and women in uniform in the Second World War, between 1941 and 45, in uniform, serving around the world in the Atlantic and Pacific theaters in our fight against Hitler's Germany and Tojo's Japan. But what is it about our time that is so complex, so threatening, so dangerous, but also filled with some opportunities? Well, the way to illustrate that is, let me take you through a walk, or come with me in a walk through the White House. You all have a mental image of the White House. And you know that President Obama and his family live in the 2nd and 3rd floors, and President Obama has the easiest commute in world history, and certainly in Washington. He just comes down his elevator with a Secret Service detail every morning. He walks through the Rose Garden. You can picture the Rose Garden created by Jacqueline Kennedy 50 years ago. He enters the side door of the locus of power, not just in our country, but really the locus of power in the world, the West Wing and the Oval Office, created a little over 100 years ago by Theodore Roosevelt. And in that Oval Office, you've all seen it in TV, the fireplace, the 2 chairs, and the desk. And on the desk are 2 inboxes, just like we have inboxes where we work. One of them is domestic policy, and that's piled a mile high with problems that we're debating, Governor Romney and President Obama the other night, and in the other debates, health care. How do we tax and regulate businesses and individuals, abortion, gun control, everything about domestic policy? I am not competent to talk to you about that. I didn't spend my adult career working on that. But there is another inbox called national security, international policy, foreign policy, and I've got some expertise and information about that, and that's about a mile high with problems. What's in that inbox? I think if you go through it, and this is what the president faces every morning, and by the way, the same rough inbox that Hu Jintao in China and Manmohan Singh in India and Dilma Rousseff in Brazil and Angela Merkel in Germany, the other great powers face. It's the most complex agenda we've faced as Americans in our history. And it begins with the Great Recession. Because while the economists tell us it's over, tell that to the 7.8% Americans still unemployed. Tell it to the people who've lost their homes to foreclosure. Tell it to the young kids, thinking about Bob's presentation just now, having great difficulty leaving our high schools, our trade schools, our best universities, and getting jobs. The youth unemployment rate so much bigger than the adult unemployment rate. So that's the first issue. That issue would dominate the agenda, the term of any of our presidents in American history, because President Obama presides over the largest economy in the world, the most innovative economy in the world, and we are the country that's got to pull the rest of the world out of recession and forward to global growth. And as we've seen from the campaign, that's the big issue. Behind the Great Recession and our big economic problems is the fact that we're still at war. And you know, it's funny, you read the papers, you look at TV, you live your life. There isn't constant conversation about the fact that we still have 68,000 men and women serving in Afghanistan. And we're going to keep on present levels those 68,000 people there for a long time until the president, whomever we elect on November 6th decides we're going to draw them down. The other night they both said they'd have us out, most of our forces, by 2014. What neither of them said is that both of them are considering leaving what we call a residual force, a small group of soldiers, 5, 10, 15, 20,000 soldiers, to continue to fight al-Qaeda, the Haqqani network, and the other terrorists on the Afghan-Pakistan border. So we're not out of Afghanistan, and we just got out of Iraq, and we've just finished a decade, from 9/11 to 2012, the longest period of war in American history. We've never fought a war as long as Afghanistan. We've never tried to deploy so many hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight in true great land wars in all of our history. So the Great Recession, the war in Afghanistan, our recent liberation from Iraq, what else is in that foreign policy inbox on President Obama's desk? Iran and North Korea. They just happen to be in the two most vital parts of the world for the United States, Iran in the Middle East, North Korea in East Asia. Iran seeking a nuclear weapons capability, which if they achieve it, would threaten the existence of the State of Israel, threaten all the moderate Arab countries, particularly the important countries of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain. And Iran is steaming towards that nuclear weapon, and we've got to figure out a way to stop them. Will we stop them in 2013 by diplomacy, by sitting down with them, by trying to see if there's some kind of compromise that might prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon? I'm in favor of that. Or are we going to resort to war? Or will Israel get ahead of us and strike on its own and drag us, perhaps, into a third land war in the greater Middle East in the last decade? The stakes are very high in Iran. In North Korea, even more harrowing. I don't know if you know who's now running North Korea after the death of Kim Jong-il. It's the third son, previously unemployed, no management experience, 28 years old. He comes from a gangster, mafia-type family. That's the only way I can describe the North Korean dictatorship. And he's now the proud owner and possessor of nuclear weapons. Doesn't really make you feel confident about the world when you get up in the morning. So the recession, our economic problems, the war problems we have, Iran and North Korea, and we're just getting started on this inbox. Because behind that, of course, is the Euro debt crisis. Now that may sound like an abstract crisis, but consider this. Europe's our largest trade partner. Europe's the largest investor in our country. Dollars and euros being invested in our businesses to hire Americans and to make our companies grow. And Europe has the largest collection of American allies in the world, 26 European allies in NATO. And so what happens in the Euro debt crisis really matters to us. I've been to Europe twice in the last month. People are very worried there, economists, officials, citizens, that they might go into a double-dip recession. And should they go into a double-dip recession, that'll knock at least a percentage point off our gross domestic product, our economic growth rates here in the United States as we try to drive ourselves out, lift ourselves out of our own economic recession. You've got that problem, and then, of course, you have the Arab revolutions. The Arab Spring, as people call it, the Arab uprisings. And that's difficult for us to get our arms around. It's 22 different Arab countries, all in a state, say, on 22 different train tracks of fermentation, of revolution, deeply rooted social change, some of it very positive. You'll remember January 2011, all those idealistic, hopeful young people in Tahrir Square in Cairo saying, give us some of the freedom that's been denied to us by our dictators over the last 50 or 60 years. You know, there have been free elections in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya that have produced moderate governments who are talking to us, who work with us. That's worked out pretty well. But on the other end of the Arab world, you've got Syria, in open civil war between a despotic government and very brave rebel groups, 30,000 people dead in a year and a half in that civil war. Civil war in Yemen as well. So we're seeing the good and bad in the Arab revolutions. And I haven't even gotten to the heart of President Obama's inbox. Because the issues that I experienced, particularly in the latter part of my career, working for President Clinton and President George W. Bush, are the transnational issues. You know, the issues that affect every single human being. And that's the first time in history that's happened, that everyone's being affected by the same forces. The issues that are going under our borders and over our borders and right through our borders, like climate change and like trafficking of women and children and drug and crime cartels that are on the streets of all of our cities in the United States, highly organized, preying on our young kids. And by the way, they're all over the world. And these transnational problems include the threat of pandemics and world food shortages. It's a very difficult set of issues, and it includes the nightmare issue that I think is probably the greatest threat to all of us as human beings. You know, they ask presidential candidates, you know, what's the worst thing that could happen? Well, the worst thing that could happen was that a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda could get its hands on weapons of mass destruction. And the only way I can illustrate that for you is to remember 9/11, September 11, 2001. We all remember where we were and what we were doing and how we felt when 3,000 people died in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Washington. But think about this. If Al-Qaeda with evil intent, had nuclear suitcase bomb technology, or chemical weapons, or biological weapons, weapons of mass destruction, they would have assuredly killed 3,000 people, more than 3,000 people on 9/11. I mean, what killed the 3,000 people? Our lost citizens. It was Al-Qaeda using the most crude means available. They flew airplanes into buildings, and the resulting explosion, the crash, the explosion, the falling buildings, the fire killed people. But chemical weapons at the World Trade Center or biological weapons would have killed, who knows, 30,000, 300,000 people in lower Manhattan and northern New Jersey. So the stakes here are really high. Now at this point, as we go through the inbox, you're about to say, stop. This is depressing, it's harrowing, it's too negative on a Wednesday afternoon. So let me tell you, there's some positive, hopeful issues in that inbox that President Obama, President Bush, President Clinton have all been able to build upon. And I'll just name a couple. Think of the fact, and Boston's a good place to talk about this because we're a science technology city, that science, technology, and medical advances will change our lives for the better. Think of the power of overcoming cancer. Think of what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have done to help reduce the incidence of HIV/AIDS and treat people who are HIV/AIDS positive. And what the United States government with NGOs are doing to cut into malaria incidence rates in places like sub-Saharan Africa. That's a powerful, positive agent of change that our younger generation can embrace for the future. Here's a second one. Poverty rates are falling all over the world. There are 7 billion people in the world. There are over 2 billion people who live below UN-declared poverty lines. That is, you make less than $2.25 a day or $1.25 a day. But I think when historians write the history of our time, they're going to say, well, that was the time at the end of the 20th century, early in the 21st, where China lifted several 100 million people out of poverty in the greatest recorded economic expansion in history, China, over the last 30 years. And India, with its democratic government, doing the same. And so that's hopeful. Let me give you one more hopeful example that's in the inbox. And that is that the great powers are at peace. Now that sounds, again, very abstract. What does that mean? Well, for most of the last 400 or 500 years, the great powers have been at war. Just take the last century, the century that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had to deal with. 16 million people died in the First World War between 1914 and 1918. 60 million people, 60, died in the Second World War. When great powers clash, they produce these global catastrophes called total war. And right now, for a lot of different reasons, the great powers, the United States, the Russian Federation, China, India, Brazil, and the European Union, the biggest economies, the biggest militaries, are at peace with each other. China is living inside the system that Britain and America created after the Second World War. The international system of economics and trade and commerce and military alliance. No one's contesting the system. That gives me a little bit of hope for the future. Now, I can't take you through the inbox and through a tour of the White House and give you all those challenges and opportunities and not give you a couple of thoughts about how we as citizens can play a role in overcoming the dark side of globalization, as Tom Friedman has called it. And that's in the first issues in the inbox, and embrace the positive side of globalization and try to make the world what we all want it to be, more just, more stable, more peaceful. So here's some ideas that we can think about as Americans and as citizens of the world. This is not just for Americans. Here's the first one. President Clinton's 1992 campaign slogan. Anybody remember what it was? It's the economy, stupid. Was what President Clinton and James Carville and George Stephanopoulos said. What does that mean? Our power, our ability to act in the world, to have a strong military, a strong diplomatic corps, to have development aid, to participate in all these great things, rests on our economic health here at home. And if the economic ship of state is listing, if we're in bad shape, if we can't balance our budgets, if our people can't work, then we can't be strong overseas. There's a direct correlation, and both President Obama and Governor Romney drew attention to that last week. So the first thing we've got to do is right the ship, insist that our political leaders bring us compromise in Washington and bring us some appropriate level of taxation and budget reductions that would get this economy going again. That's the first thing. The second thing, resist isolationism. Americans have this habit over 230-odd years of retreating, sometimes when times are tough, into isolationism. You see the Tea Party pretty much standing for that right now in its foreign policy. It might have made sense for 1812 in a world that was not globalized, but 2012, when so many of our jobs depend on exports, when we are so united around the world, we need to be engaged in the world and resist isolation. And third, and here's my final message, remember two words in the English language that have always motivated Americans and animated us and really brought out the best in us. The words are hope and peace. The word hope, think of our greatest figures at the toughest times. Lincoln saved us. He preserved the Union. He redeemed the promise of America by overcoming our original sin in our Constitution that said that African Americans are 3/5 of a citizen. That's hope. And Martin Luther King, 100 years later, brought us the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and a peaceful life for African Americans. And think of peace. 50 years ago this week, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev almost came to nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they compromised at the end. They pulled back from war, and they preserved the lives of hundreds of millions of people who would have assuredly been killed in a nuclear holocaust. And Kennedy, in his greatest speech, said several months later, and this is about the peaceful part, we need a strategy for peace in America, not just a strategy for war. It's an important message for Americans after 9/11. We have to secure ourselves, of course, and defend ourselves, but we've got to always be looking for peace. And Kennedy said in this speech at American University, he said, for in the final analysis, we all inhabit this same small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. America has this tremendous capacity for change, hope, dynamism, in leading the rest of the world and in fixing the problems in our own society. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and all best. Thank you.